Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Darshan Talks. I'm here with the wonderful Patti Zettler, who is incredible because she is an associate professor at Ohio State University. I'm really excited to have her. She's been on before. I'm going to let her introduce herself, but she and I are hoping, if the conversation doesn't go left, which happens often enough, but to talk about stem cell and stem gene therapy. And what are the rules and regulations surrounding that? But before we get started, Patti, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit better than I just did?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thank you so much for having me, Darshan. It's always a delight to be on and chat with you. My name is Patti Zettler. I'm an associate professor of law at the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law and a member of Ohio State's Drug Enforcement and Policy Center and its Comprehensive Cancer Center. And I study and research FDA law and policy. So again, just super wonderful to be here.
Well, thank you for coming on. So before we get started, Patti, do you want to set the groundwork for cell and gene therapy? What is the FDA's general sort of perspective on it? When we talk about cell and gene therapy, for example, are we talking about, and for those people who are about to lose me, I'm going to say this and then, Patti, you can explain what I mean. Are we only talking about 351 HCTPs, 361 HCTPs, both, or something totally different?
Yeah, so this is, I think, a really interesting time to be talking about cell and gene therapies and including stem cell interventions because there is, as we might talk about in just a few minutes, some ongoing litigation trying to sort of figure out where the lines are between Section 361 HCTPs and products that FDA can regulate as drugs and require pre-market approval for. Before we get into the substance, I do just quickly want to plug the International Society for Cell and Gene Therapy, or ISCT. Now, I'm here in my individual capacity, not with my ISCT hat on, and I'm not unbiased in plugging ISCT. I'm a member of ISCT, and I co-chair the Committee on the Ethics of Cell and Gene Therapy, and I chair its subcommittee on expanded access. But for those listeners who may not know, ISCT is a global society for a wide variety of cell and gene therapy stakeholders, including clinicians, regulators, researchers, technologists, industry, and the vision of the society is to translate cell and gene interventions into safe and effective therapies to improve patients' lives. So it's a fantastic group with lots of great conferences and other events and opportunities to work towards clinical translation of cell and gene therapies in the global context. Again, I'm here in my individual capacity, not speaking on behalf of ISCT, but I do encourage folks to check out the website. And the annual meeting this year is in Paris, so a good time to attend the annual meeting if you're interested.
Well, I think everyone's having their moment of Emily in Paris, so you too can have that moment.
Right.
But going on, so thank you for plugging them, and thank you for sort of telling people about Paris, which I think is always nice. But please continue.
Yeah. So I mean, I was really excited to come on and talk with you, just sort of about what's going on in the cell and gene therapy space, and maybe specifically with stem cell intervention. I do think it's a really, potentially interesting time with respect to regulation in this space. There's, as I'm sure you know, Darshan, and listeners may know, back in 2017, FDA announced that it would exercise enforcement discretion with respect to pre-market approval or IND requirements for certain cell interventions, and that enforcement discretion period ended in May 2021. So we're in this new era where, at least in theory, and I think FDA is enforcing pre-market approval and IND requirements as broadly as it thinks it can. At the same time, there's some litigation going on. And just last year, there was a decision in California from a federal judge that that judge disagreed with a lot of FDA's interpretations about which HCTPs fall into the Section 361 bucket, which means regulated only pursuant to Section 361 of the Public Health Service Act, no pre-market approval requirements, or a different exception, the same surgical procedure exception. The judge basically said, FDA, you're interpreting those buckets too narrowly, and fewer things are subject to your approval requirements than you say they are. I believe, Darshan, I don't know if you know, I'm talking off the top of my head, I think FDA has indicated it will be appealing the decision to the Ninth Circuit. So we should get a Ninth Circuit opinion on this issue. But I think, there's just a lot happening right now in this space in terms of, the science advancing, but also questions about where regulation is going to go. Not legal advice. Yes, thank you. I forgot to give my standard caveat that everything I'm saying is for educational and informational purposes only and is not legal advice. But so there is this ongoing litigation. There have been 2 other decisions in the 11th Circuit and the DC Circuit where courts agreed with FDA's position that it could regulate some of these stem cell or cell-based interventions that clinics are offering as drugs. But then there's this opinion in California sort of raising questions about how broadly FDA can enforce pre-market approval requirements. So a lot happening.
Could we? I think you're really talking about like the cutting edge stuff because that is the world you live in. But I kind of want to talk about like the absolute basics for people who don't even know what cell and gene therapy is. So what do we first of all mean by cell and gene therapy? How is this different from, say, an NDA and an application for and how is that different? Does it go under a BLA? Does it go under an NDA? Why does it matter? Could we start from there?
Yeah, so typically we are talking about products that go under a BLA, and there's an office within CBER known as OTAT. That I'm blanking on what the acronym stands for, but I can look it up.
OTAT. I'll look it up while you keep talking.
So there is an office in CBER that focuses on these products specifically, and the sort of overall regulatory structure is that human gobbledygooking HCTP. Some human cells, tissues, and cellular and tissue-based products, or HCTPs, are regulated only under Section 361 of the Public Health Service Act. And that provision in the Public Health Service Act is basically a protection against spreading disease, but it doesn't involve requirements to demonstrate that the product is safe and effective, does what it says, the distributor or provider says it will do. And FDA has a regulation where it talks about what kinds of cell and tissue-based products are these more lightly regulated Section 361 HCTPs. And it's things like the cells or tissues have undergone no more than minimal manipulation, and they're intended for homologous use, so the same kind of use at the end of the process as they were used for when they were taken from a patient's body. So these are meant to be things that are not really changed a lot and are used for the same general purposes when they're implanted in a patient. There's another exception known as the same surgical procedure exception, where if as part of the practice of medicine, a provider is taking cells or tissue out of a patient and reimplanting in the same procedure with some other sort of requirements, that also is not subject to FDA pre-market approval. Things that don't fall into one of those 2 buckets, Section 361 HCTPs or the same surgical procedure exception, are regulated as sort of biologic therapeutics. So they have all the same requirements that would apply essentially to a drug, that if you're going to conduct a clinical trial with them, then you need an IND, and before you are going to sell the products to patients for a profit, you need a BLA where you're demonstrating that the product is safe and effective for its intended use.
So we have a situation where there's all this complexity. Can we start by talking about the 2 exceptions before we jump into the 351s? Because the 351s obviously are relatively understood because they follow many of the same procedures as a new drug application. But let's talk about the 361 HCTP and the same surgical procedure exception, because they are they're the reason you're getting a lot of litigation, but there's also a lot of reasons why people like this process. So when you talk about the same surgical procedure, you said it's a totally different piece than the no more than minimal manipulation exception. Could you talk a little bit more about what those two pieces are? And the reason I'm asking this question is the last time I looked into it was a few years ago. And I wasn't aware of this same surgical procedure exception. So it's been several years, as you can tell. What is the thought process but as a pharmacist, I remember actually dispensing stem cell therapies, and it's very routinely done even today. I don't know if hospitals know that the FDA's jurisdiction has changed and their enforcement discretion has changed. So talk to me a little bit about what exception are hospitals usually operating under. I doubt that they are going down the pathway of getting an FDA IND approval and kind of going down that path. So what are they generally operating under? What are they thinking about? Is their thought process valid?
Yeah, so I mean, I would be wary to sort of tread into talking about what healthcare institutions or providers' thought processes might be. You know, I think from sort of a legal regulatory perspective, the general idea is that there are some things that FDA does not regulate within the practice of medicine, and there could be autologous skin grafting within a surgery, right? That would be a use of a tissue within the same surgical procedure that we wouldn't expect FDA to regulate like a drug. I think what has become challenging over time is that as science and technology advance, there are things that are maybe in a bit of a gray area where, we're not quite sure if it's the kind of thing for which we need FDA oversight or not, or it may not be clear to healthcare professionals and institutions when they're sort of crossing the line into what might be considered a drug. Now, I mean, I think FDA has done a lot to try to clarify this. There are a number of guidance documents out there. The agency, as I mentioned, did announce this enforcement discretion policy back in 2017, along with a sort of comprehensive approach to regulation in this area. But it is tough, right? I mean, there's sort of no way around the fact that it is tough. And I think against that background of it, there being some, legitimately difficult lines to draw, there are a number of clinics that I think have built business models around not, we're a big academic medical center or a big hospital, and we sometimes do these kinds of procedures, but where the entire business model is based on cell and tissue-based products without FDA authorization. And those are the kinds of clinics that there are two researchers, Lee Turner at UC Irvine and Paul Knopfler at UC Davis, they've done sort of mapping of how many clinics there are marketing unproven stem cell interventions and what kinds of things they're selling. And I encourage folks to look up their work. Paul is a stem cell biologist, if I'm recalling his bio correctly, and Lee is a bioethicist at UC Irvine. So it's great work. But there's kind of a wide range of things that are happening, and there's also this sort of there are these legitimate questions about how should I be regulated and how am I regulated that could come up. But there's some things that probably are clearly should be regulated, some things we might have legitimate questions about, and some things that are clearly outside of FDA authority.
So maybe we should start. There's so many words here that the average lawyer, the average pharmacist may even struggle with. Things like homologous versus autologous. The truth is, you would think that as scientists, people with clinical knowledge, pharmacists would know as you're preparing things. Truth is, many won't. But you're talking about in the case of certain types of autologous skin grafts, for example, you were saying, well, that might be okay. Why would that be okay? What is the thought process if it's not from the same location? Why do we think, what is the thought process behind saying that should fall under the practice of medicine exception versus homologous, which is coming in from the same location back to the same location?
Yeah, I mean, I am not sure I can answer that. I guess I would turn the question back to you. You're the person with the scientific background.
Sure.
What do you think?
Oh, fair point. So, thank you for doing that, because I forget sometimes I'm just as subject to these questions as you are, as the interviewer. So my thought process, my general thought process would be skin's the same across your body. So as long as the biological conditions don't dramatically change, there's no reason why skin from my leg being moved to my hand should really be a huge issue. On the other hand, if you take, and I've seen questions like this, if I take stem cells from the cardiac tissue and try to put it onto my hand because for some reason I think that that's going to be better, I think it raises all new questions of safety and efficacy, because I don't know what the implications, what the impact of that are. And that might be fine if you do it under the auspices of an IRB, or sort of with appropriate oversight. But as you pointed out, that's often not the case. One of the big advantages you have as a healthcare practitioner is the practice of medicine is guarded. It's governed by the state boards. You get to say things like, it's part of my purview. It's something that I think is appropriate for this patient, which is fine overall. But when you make that into your entire business model, and you're offering, let's say, that same exact scenario, and I'm not sure why you do it, but let's say you take stem cells from the heart and move it to your hand, and then say it's an anti-aging therapy. I think that changes the purpose of what you are doing, and not just that it's costing patients money. You might start asserting, and it could be tens of millions of dollars. You could start claiming, for example, it's anti-cancer, and if that's true, you're giving people hope, false hope, and that's problematic as well. So I think there's very clearly issues of safety and efficacy that could be raised that are unaddressed if the FDA doesn't step in some situations. So that would be my thought process. Does that sound consistent with what you're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that is a good way to think about the rationale between the lines FDA has tried to draw in the regulations, that for some things, we don't really think there's a question about effectiveness. As you pointed out, if you take skin from your leg and graft it onto your hand, we don't really think there's a huge question about whether that will be effective, assuming everything's done as well as possible.
Right.
And so there just isn't really an appropriate or a need for FDA pre-market approval. But when you start going beyond those things where we don't know about effectiveness and we don't know about safety, that's where FDA really has a strong role to play. And I think there are these concerns about patient safety, as you noted, that, in some cases, the best case scenario might be the patient's out of a lot of money.
Right.
The worst case scenario might be they're out of a lot of money and that they've suffered some physical harm. But even just thinking about sort of the industry and the hope for the science overall, I mean, I think there's a real risk that if there aren't the incentives in place and the requirements in place to do rigorous research and really understand what the potential therapeutic uses are, that we'll lose the opportunity to benefit kind of in a healthcare space in society from the genuine potential that these technologies have.
So you're exploring this, and you're helping the International Society for Cell and Gene Therapy, and when you are doing that, I assume you're presumably talking to them about some of these rules. What is the overall scientist version of this? Because my experience with scientists is that they want the minimal oversight possible so that they can do their research. How do we balance subject or patient needs against researcher needs, and what is that balance from a scientific perspective, not from a regulator's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think as one might imagine with a global society, right, there aren't uniform views across all members or anything like that. But, I do think there is a real interest in helping the field advance, and a concern that if there aren't appropriate regulatory structures in place, that there will be markets selling unproven interventions that harm patients, and in the long run harm the science, that make it hard for researchers to do the trials they want to do, or do the research they want to do, that delay translation to safe and effective therapies. So I actually don't see the researcher and the patient interests as not aligned here. I mean, of course, there are always concerns about regulatory burdens, and no one wants unnecessary regulatory burdens, including lawyers, right? But I think ultimately, in the long run, the interests are aligned. That researchers are trying to figure out how to translate cell and gene interventions into safe and effective therapies. Safe and effective therapies are what patients want. There might be some quibbles about how we get there, but I do think in the long run the goals are aligned.
I agree with you that in the long run they're aligned. It's always a short run that I worry about, and what I mean by that is slightly off topic, but I think about a few years ago. I believe there was a Chinese scientist who created clones of these children. And he loved the fact that he was working in China. He wasn't oppressed by many of the same rules that we have in the US. And I think there was recent news in the last week or 2 weeks or something, or at least I saw it in the last week or 2 weeks. And he's like, you know what? That was a mistake. I should have had better oversight when I was doing this. So it's lessons learned over time. But what is appropriate is one of those questions. I mean, I'll give you the flip side of that same discussion. People have been talking about not doing research on, and now I'm going back. This is during the George Bush era, but the first George Bush era, if I remember correctly. But they were talking about not doing work on stem cells at all because of the risk to basically babies and using embryonic stem cells. So obviously, those are two different extremes of the same problem: overregulation, underregulation, and then there's the middle. I guess it's really more of a comment. But what I hear you saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong, do you believe that this situation can be resolved in any simple ways? I'll give you an example of what I was thinking might be a simple way. You can work with non-FDA approved therapies on subjects, but you cannot charge more than X amount for the therapy. And by saying something like that, what you've done is really try to remove the profit motive, and then try to move people into the research process. But is that too simplistic?
So there already is that set up a little bit, right?
Oh, okay.
If we're conducting research under an IND, you are permitted to charge. You just have to, you're limited in what you can charge.
Sure.
Direct costs, and there's some requirement to justify what you're charging to FDA. I worry about that though, because there are things that clinics can charge for that are not the product themselves. They could charge an exorbitant amount for the visit to see the provider and not for the product itself. So there might be ways to maintain the profit motive without violating requirements that are attached to charging for the product itself. I mean, I think overall there are some, to the extent that folks are worried about regulatory burdens, there are some signs that FDA is trying to think creatively in this space. Last year, I believe, Peter Marks, who's the head of CBER, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, made some comments, or was quoted in a news article about the agency considering whether there might be some kind of intermediate pathway for certain kinds of cell interventions. So not a free-for-all with no evidence of safety and effectiveness, but not a full BLA either. Now, I haven't seen anything since that news article, which was probably, 5 or 6 months ago now. So I don't know what's happened with that, but I do think there is a real recognition among regulators that, that this is a place where they might think creatively. And in other countries, there have been some kinds of different approaches. I will probably mangle the details if I try to talk about it off the top of my head, but I know Japan is one place that has had a different pathway for cell-based interventions.
Now, what I find interesting is you're 100% right. In the case of research, you are subject to things like fair market value and those kinds of controls, if you will, and being able to justify those costs. What I was thinking about is non-research based stem and gene therapy type treatments. The FDA couldn't really exert jurisdiction over them in the same way because that would fall into practice of medicine at that point. But I guess my overall question there is we've seen a heightened amount of enforcement in the advertisement from OPDP and Appleby to the claims being made by these companies. Have you? I don't know. Has that been a space you've been looking at, or not really?
I haven't followed the OPDP or the advertising and promotion letters. I will say, to go back to your earlier comment, that if we're talking about the provision of investigational unapproved interventions for treatment purposes, FDA does regulate in that space too, right? Those are expanded access programs, and we do see those in the cell and gene therapy space. Companies in the U.S. could use the federal right to try law if they are complying with all of the requirements in that law. Both of those pathways also restrict the amount that can be charged, but again, for the intervention itself. So, I think there are reasons to be worried that there might still be ways to commercialize outside of charging just for the product itself.
Your point is well made, so thank you. And we can get into all of that again, but thank you. So I just want to summarize where we are just to get all the points down, right? So we've got the 351 HCTPs, which is sort of you file the BLA, file the IND, and go through the approval process. You've got two different exceptions. One is the surgical exception.
The same surgical procedure exception. Yeah.
Same surgical procedure exception. And then you've got the no more than minimal manipulation exception, if you will, for lack of a better term. And those are the two exceptions. You basically, from a litigation standpoint, you've got multiple states that have agreed that the FDA has used the right buckets for the most part in regulating, except for California, where there's been shall we say, a difference of opinions, and that might get appealed to the California, I guess it'll be Supreme Court, or at least the Court of Appeals.
So these are federal cases. So it's
these are federal. Okay.
Yeah, the 11th Circuit and the DC Circuit have agreed with FDA's, interpretations of these buckets as applied to some specific products, and then there's a judge in California, a federal judge, who has disagreed with FDA, and I believe, but I might be wrong because I'm remembering this off the top of my head, that FDA intends to appeal to the 9th Circuit, that California decision.
There you go. But stay tuned. Things are changing. And when all this is happening, we also spoke a little bit about how other countries like Japan are doing their own methods to try to control and regulate this process. So that should all be interesting. Did I miss any big components?
No, I don't think so. I think it's a challenging regulatory space, and I think a challenging space for everyone, because it is difficult to kind of figure out what bucket any given cell-based intervention falls into.
Patti, any parting words?
No, just thank you for your time. As always, it's a pleasure to chat, and I'll look forward to next time.